Hello and welcome back to Spoiler Goblin, where today we'll be discussing the beginning of the long history between Archie Comics and Sega by discussing the first issue of their Sonic the Hedgehog comics. That said, they didn't start with the main series that most of us are aware of. Over the months before the debut of the main series, we are introduced to the world of Sonic instead through a 4-issue miniseries. We'll be covering each entry before getting along to the main event in later videos. For your perspective, this series was released between February and May of 1993, between the releases of Sonic the Hedgehog 2 and Sonic CD. There were 2 Sonic television shows in production at the time, but neither would make it to air until September of the same year. The first issue of this miniseries was the cheekily titled Sonic No. 0, which is placed as a predecessor comic in order to establish the world, which, in my opinion, it does quite well. The first story takes place with the world and characters already in the status quo that we would get to know far better later. It starts by introducing the characters and their relationship to each other, of course opening with the 2 stars of the comic, who I believe need no introduction: Sonic Maurice Hedgehog and Dr. Ivo Robotnik. These 2, of course, are still headliners of the franchise. It establishes the 2 of them quite well, with Robotnik on a murderous rampage, and Sonic really just toying with him. From there, Sonic introduces us to his home, the hidden village of Knothole, and we're shown the next familiar face in the form of Miles Tails Prower, the Fox, who introduces his character quite bluntly with the introductory lines, "Sonic, my hero!" Yeah, subtlety isn't really this comic's strong suit. From there, though, we get into characters that are a little more obscure, having not shown up really outside the comic and the animated show that came alongside it. The first of these we see is Rotor the Walrus, though he's not known by that name yet. While his name would later be changed, here he's called Boomer, and he kinda looks like he was designed by one. He's wearing nothing but a utility belt and a backwards baseball cap. The 90s were a weird time. He is probably the least characterized member of the main cast in the first issue, but takes on the role of the team's sarcastic gearhead. The next character we have is by far the most famous of the newcomers, but also the least recognizable. Meet Princess Sally Acorn, the chipmunk. Those of us who weren't fans of the comic in 1993 may take a second to register that it's her. She's without the customary jacket we've all come to know, as well as sporting an entirely different design, instead being more recognizable as a chipmunk with a blonde wig on. This design was later changed as plans for the Sonic Saturday morning cartoon series were finalized a few months later. She's the noble leader of the group, who's had enough of Sonic's shit, though also has a crush on him, just like every other female character seems to at some point or another, at least in those days. If you don't know Sally, I highly suggest checking out this video by the Game Apologist, where he covers her history as a character and why she's so beloved by many people who grew up reading the comic, both him and myself included. Generally, a lot of the series was inspired by him, so by all means, go check out more of his stuff. The last character is Antoine de Coulette, the Coyote, the stick-in-the-mud, French-styled military man who's both Sonic's rival for Sally's affection and the comic relief, being both a coward and a fool in many regards. Okay, so they aren't exactly the most original crew at this point, but they fit the bill and they do have a long way to go later on. The book then goes on to introduce us to the world by way of showing us both what it's capable of and what Robotnik is willing to do with it, by introducing us to the Weeping Willow Trees, a stand of trees along the edge of the great forest that Sonic and his furry friends call home, who are actually sentient living creatures that are crying because Robotnik showed up and uprooted their friends from right next to them so they could be destroyed. In case anyone ever wondered why Sonic was seen as environmentalist series, this is a regular thing. Ancillary materials work time and again to show that Robotnik hates 3 things in this world: fun, nature, and that blasted blue hedgehog, and he will go to any means to destroy those things. The comic then introduces us to a location that will become far more important later. A well where Sonic keeps one of his magic rings, which he uses to power up and defeat Robotnik. That said, it is still next to unrecognizable from later interpretations, being just a regular well with a ring inside of it. Also, in the canon of this miniseries, Sonic has to jump through the ring like a hula hoop in order to gain its power, and that's just both strange and hilarious to me. With Robotnik defeated for the day, Sonic and his friends celebrate the win by planting trees. Subtlety. The final story of the issue is a backstory to the series, showing Eggman's rise to power and Sonic's first meeting with Sally. I won't go into it too much, since the general events are retconned hard in later comics, and honestly this whole miniseries is pretty much not canon. But this is the first appearance of Sonic's Uncle Chuck and his dog Mutsky. And yes, the hedgehog is a pet dog. Yes, that's actually explained. Eventually. Also, it's interesting just how much the idea of robotization would change as the series progressed. Here, Uncle Chuck just looks like a hypnotized version of his regular self, but that would change very quickly. The next issue, the actual #1 of the miniseries, released 2 months later, in March 1993, and began the style of short-form one-off stories that we had come to know for some time. The first story follows one that the comic would see retold time and time again, of one freedom fighter, in this case Sally, getting captured by Robotnik on purpose so they could use whatever knowledge they gathered to either destroy the roboticizers or learn to reverse engineer them. Which, of course, always failed because the freedom fighters don't share information with each other for some reason. The other long-form story in this comic, Something's Fishy, sees Sonic fighting with Jaws, a fish badnik who is an underwater roboticizer. There were also a number of one-page quote-unquote stories in this issue, as well as the previous one. These one-panel jokes were often puns or obvious jokes towards the characters or Sonic's speed, though it does have this hard hitter about Congress trying to pass an anti-pollution bill. What did I tell you about subtlety, folks? One of these pages also is the first introduction of the character of Bunny Rabbit, though once again not with her finalized color choices. Speaking of color choices, this is also the first comic to show Sally as both pink and a brunette, at least one step closer to her final design. Issue 2, released in April 1993, was titled A Crowning Achievement, and features only one 4-part story about Sonic tracking down the Freedom Emeralds, which give power to Sally's ancestral piece of headwear, the Crown of Acorns, which would actually remain relevant to the series as we move on. There are also, of course, a few one-off gags in the comic, including Robotnik is Wolverine. Honestly, for as cheesy as it is, the top 10 reasons why Sonic the Hedgehog is the coolest comic book around is a treat, so I suggest reading it yourself sometime. The fourth and final issue of this miniseries was released in May 1993, and once again featured 2 stories, though none of the shorter spreads like were the previous issues. The first of these was Sonic Flashback, the most frightening thing to ever be released as official Sonic media, because it showed this. Behold your doom, mortals, for Robbie Robotnik takes no prisoners. It tells the story of Sonic imagining what life would be like if he and Robotnik had grown up together, which pretty much looks like it would have ended very similarly. Thankfully, this is never, ever mentioned again. The second story is Why Ask Spy, which features Sonic dressing up as a roboticized version of himself by putting a bear trap over his mouth and spiral contact lenses in his eyes. He then goes to infiltrate Robotnik's base of operations. Also, I'd like to point out how, once again, the Freedom Fighters are terrible at communication, and Tails actually believes that his idol, Sonic, has become a robot. Though horniness for a girl twice his age has him forgetting that fact very quickly. Also, interestingly, we see the first case of full-body robotization in this story, with Mutsky here looking more similar to the robot dogs from Kingsman 2 than to his original form. And that's the Archie Sonic miniseries. While it's referenced a couple times later, anything important was mostly retconned later on. It has moments that are both incredibly cheesy and way past terrible, but they're interesting as published pieces of concept art, showing the development of the characters, world, and stories that would come much later.